Hello and welcome. A dishonourable deserter or an honourable objector? Where do you draw the line on troops who refuse to fight in Iraq or Afghanistan? Soldiers who resist these wars on moral or ethical grounds may be following their conscience, but they can also face tremendous stigma, dismissal from service without benefits, a long imprisonment and prison records for failing to carry out the duties they signed up to perform. Thousands of serving US soldiers have deserted from military service since the start of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some resist fighting on conscientious objector grounds, while others refuse to redeploy after being traumatized by painful frontline experiences. But US military spokesman emphasized that overall, just 1% of all troops desert their duties, far fewer than during the height of the Vietnam War, which used many drafted troops. Several hundred Iraq and Afghanistan war resistors have fled to Canada to avoid prosecution, where a few dozen have officially applied for asylum. In the last few weeks, 2 soldiers from Fort Hood in Texas have been court-martialed because they refused to deploy to Afghanistan, and a British soldier also faces military discipline for writing a letter to British Prime Minister Gordon Brown explaining why he is refusing to return to Afghanistan. On today's show, we ask, can serving military troops refuse to fight in wars they do not agree with, or do soldiers in today's voluntary army sign away their rights to object when they join up? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room and take part, and we'll welcome your phone calls onto the show as well. Joining me on the program today from Houston, Texas is Dahar Jamel, an independent journalist who was one of the few unembedded reporters to cover the war in Iraq and a recipient of the 2008 Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. He's just written a new book, The Will to Resist: Soldiers Who Refuse to Fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. Here with me in Washington, D.C. is Philip Riley, Director of National Security and Foreign Relations for the American Legion. He's also a highly decorated U.S. Army colonel who retired after 27 years of commissioned service. I welcome you both to the program. And Dahar Jamel, if I could start with you there in Houston. There have been conscientious objectors in the past, many during the Vietnam War, as we know. What makes the resistance to fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan that much more significant, in your opinion?
Well, today, most of the people I've been talking with who are refusing to deploy are doing so on the grounds of international law and the U.S. Constitution. For example, if you look at the UN Charter, of which the U.S. is, of course, a signatory nation, there's only 2 reasons that a country is allowed to go to war under international law. 1, that in self-defense, and 2, with UN Security Council ratification of the war. And the soldiers I've been talking with, particularly the 2 that just were sentenced to court-martial at Fort Hood the last couple of weeks here in Texas, both of them are saying that the attack against Afghanistan violates international law because it's not in self-defense, and of course there was no UN Security Council resolution for the war. And so they feel duty-bound under international law and the U.S. Constitution because the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, specifically Article 6, Paragraph 2, states that if the United States signs a treaty, then that becomes the supreme law of the land.
Okay.
So they have told me that, well, by refusing to deploy, they're actually honoring international law, the U.S. Constitution, and abiding by the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, which states that soldiers are duty-bound not to follow an illegal order.
We'll look at some of the logistics and the sort of the outcome in a moment, but let me ask you, Dahar, how widespread did you find the will to resist, as you call it?
Well, it's not a widespread movement, anything like what's happening during Vietnam. I mean, specifically, the main reason being we have an all-volunteer military now, so not having a draft has really not caused a situation like in Vietnam where we have a massive, organized, powerful GI resistance movement. But that said, we've had over 50,000 troops go AWOL since 2000, and just since 2007, we've had a 42% increase of troops going AWOL in the Army. And I think we should expect these numbers to increase while we are watching this massive escalation in Afghanistan.
Okay, let me bring in Philip Riley here. Good to have you with us, sir.
Thank you.
27 years as a decorated colonel. Obviously, you've served your country. How does the Army regard people who take this kind of action to not deploy, to desert, and so on?
Well, particularly when it's close to a deployment, that's hurting the unit. We talk about moral responsibility. I think when you raise your hand, take the oath, agree to support and defend the Constitution, and follow the lawful orders, then you've committed yourself to something. And then that commitment extends all the way to the unit level. So suddenly changing your mind and wanting not to go back with a unit that spent time training, that has bonded, hopefully, and is ready to go carry out the orders, and do its mission, it can significantly hurt it.
All right, so it has an implication on the other soldiers too.
Yes, and I think there's plenty that covers what goes into raising your hand and taking that oath, and that's a moral commitment that you make.
Well, so we had a quote from the Army on this issue, and I'll put this. It came to us in form of email from George Wright, who's a U.S. Army spokesman. Just so you know what he said. He said, "Soldiers who meet the criteria of conscientious objector are either discharged for the convenience of the government or assigned to a non-combat specialty." Now, there was an interesting comment from one of our viewers on Facebook, who through Facebook, Moin Rauf, sent us a comment saying, "Soldiers have a duty and responsibility to refuse an unlawful order if they know it to be unjust and immoral. Officers are charged with the responsibility of not only leading men into battle, but to ensure the battle is legal." And I wonder, based on what Dahar Jamel was saying at the beginning there about the legal aspect of it, and what's been said here, what rights do soldiers have to refuse?
Well, rights to refuse in terms of a lawful order has to do principally with situations in which you're using violence that could put people at risk who don't deserve to be put at risk, and I think we do a good job at trying to minimize that type of action happening. But the rights that you give up under the Uniform Code of Military Justice are made clear to you, and you have a moral obligation.
If the law, if the war is questioned as it is by some, for example, in the case of Iraq, is there any ground, in your opinion, for a soldier being able to question it?
Well, I believe we're a nation of laws. We've had a decision made by a commander-in-chief. You've sworn to follow those orders, and the question of whether the war is legal or not, I think you have to certainly think that through yourself. But the time to suddenly do it is not, that is to object, is not when you're part of a military unit to which you've already taken the oath and you've become part of, and you've trained up to do a job.
Well, let's get in a caller here. Wesley's in New Hampshire. Glad you could join us here, Wesley. What would you like to ask or say?
Yes, what I'd like to say is that to the defected soldiers, the whole purpose of joining the military in the first place was to defend your nation, and that you know fully well that you were to be trained to go to war. So why do you have to refuse to go to war when your nation asks you to go to war?
Okay.
And why did you join the military in the first place?
All right. Actually, let me get this to Dahar Jamel. Ask, to what degree, could you answer that from your opinion? If someone has signed up, basically they've made a commitment. That really does oblige them to continue to carry on through. How would you argue against that, based on what you heard from the people you researched?
Well, as said in the oath sworn by soldiers when they do sign up, it's lawful orders that they are to follow. And for example, the idea during the Nuremberg trials in the wake of World War II, when members of Hitler's regime were being tried for war crimes, they were giving the excuse, "I was just following orders." Well, given that there was a genocide happening and massive violations of international law, the court decided, well, that's just not going to carry water here if you're saying I was just following orders when you're following orders that are so clearly in violation of international law. And that's what these soldiers are saying, and the attorneys defending them are saying, that when they joined the military, they swore an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States. That is a document, that is a law. Not the person that is the current commander-in-chief, whether it be Bush or whether it be Obama, that their highest duty is to serve and defend the Constitution of the United States and lawful orders. And that means that they, as soldiers, are duty-bound to discern, to use their heads, is this a lawful order or not? If a commander gives me an order to run out and kill a baby, I have to question that order. And these soldiers are basically standing on those grounds. Look, I'm not going to be able to fall back on I was just following orders if I get sent to Iraq or Afghanistan and party to war crimes.
Okay. Hagos is on the line from Maryland in the USA. Hagos, what would you like to add to the conversation, please?
Yes. The Constitution is very clear. It is to defend the United States of America from within, not to go anywhere in the world and attack unlawfully anyone at any time. It is vulturous, it is unhuman, it is imperialistic, It is satanic.
Okay.
Americans have
Hagos?
no reason to go around the world.
Okay, Hagos, we'll get. Well, I mean, let me get Philip Riley into this debate here, and what we had there was a response from Dahar Jamil saying that that the oath there is to defend the Constitution, not necessarily based on what the Commander-in-Chief says.
Well, the Constitution establishes a government and the principles that the government will follow, and applying your own interpretation of that, your own rationalization of whether this war is legal or not, when in fact your government has acted in carrying out what the Constitution says and how it should act, I think that's being very selective.
Okay.
And
So
that's that to me, that kind of selectiveness, yes, while I can understand conscience, it also has something to do with other aspects of what it's like to be a warrior, and you have committed yourself to being a warrior.
Well, gentlemen, we'll ask you both to stand by. We've got to take a short break here. As we do, let me remind you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. We're taking a poll in there right now asking, are soldiers who refuse to fight dishonourable deserters or honourable objectors? We'll have the results from your vote on that when we come back.
Dum